Hola a todos y bienvenidos a un nuevo episodio del podcast de Arpa. Hoy hablamos con Carole Hooven, que es profesora y codirectora de la licenciatura de Biología Evolutiva Humana de la Universidad de Harvard y también autora de Testosterona, un libro de mucho éxito en inglés que Arpa ha publicado recientemente en castellano en España y que publicará también próximamente en la práctica totalidad de los países de América Latina, también en castellano. Este es el primer episodio de Arpa Talks que grabamos y que publicamos en inglés. Los que queráis subtítulos en castellano los encontraréis en nuestro canal de YouTube, pero tened en cuenta que en Spotify y las demás plataformas de audio y de podcast no hay ni doblaje ni subtítulos. Por tanto, quien quiera subtítulos en castellano, que vaya a YouTube. Y también es el primer episodio que grabamos vía webcam. Por tanto, para los que estéis viendo este episodio y no escuchándolo, tened en cuenta que la calidad y en realidad el formato no son los habituales, pero bueno, es la manera que hemos encontrado de poder invitar al canal a personas que viven tan lejos de Barcelona como Carole Hooven y de hecho, a no ser que nos demos cuenta de que os parece fatal, es un tipo de experimento que nos gustaría repetir en el futuro por eso mismo, porque nos permite ampliar el ámbito geográfico de invitados del canal. Antes de empezar, solo quiero decir una cosa, que es que este episodio y en realidad este canal, este proyecto son posibles gracias a Arpa Editores, que es la editorial de no ficción que está detrás de todo esto y que es quien paga las facturas. Por tanto, si queréis echar una mano al canal y a la editorial, pues ya sabéis, visitad la página web arpaeditores.com, suscribiros a nuestra newsletter y si podéis y si os apetece, pues comprad libros de Arpa. Y ya está, dicho todo esto, vamos con Carole Hooven. So to begin with, why did you write a book about tea? What is your relationship with tea?
My relationship with tea is complex. I'm married to a man. I think he probably has pretty high tea, at least relative to me. But I think you're asking how I got interested in the hormone, right?
Exactly.
And I should just say, we all have a relationship to tea. You have a very important one yourself. And I have a boy who's 13 years old. So he's undergoing the effects of tea right now, which are fascinating. However, the reason I think ultimately that I got interested in testosterone as my academic pursuit was because there's a long story that preceded this, but I had a career that I really wasn't super interested in after college. And I left that and I wanted to get a PhD in a program that would allow me to investigate broadly, because I really had no idea about the specifics of evolutionary biology at the time. I wanted to understand the evolutionary basis of human behavior. And I applied to the Harvard PhD program and I got rejected. And that was for many reasons. It's hard to get into the program. And I didn't have any relevant fieldwork experience. So I did not give up. I had basically already quit my job and I knew that this is what I wanted to do. And I think I was in my late 20s at the time, early 30s. And I kind of pestered the guy I wanted to work with, Richard Wrangham, and he headed up a chimpanzee, still heads up a chimpanzee research site in Uganda. And he offered me a job out there. It was supposed to be a year, and I ended up coming back after 8 months because there was a lot of violence and upheaval in the Western Uganda where I was. But so I lived in the jungle for 8 months and every day hiked out and followed the chimps around. And I was supposed to be doing some research. I never actually published that research because I just really didn't understand how to collect good data at the time. However, what I did get was this really intimate sense of the behavior, of course, of these incredible apes who are so much like us. I start tearing up when I talk about this. So I don't know, you heard my other podcast, you know, I tear up a lot because it was just such an incredible opportunity for me. And part of every day was fear on my part, essentially, if I was especially traveling, and sometimes I did go by myself with the adult males, and that was probably stupid, but I wanted to stay with them because they were really exciting. I was also interested in the female behavior, but when I was following the males, there was a lot more fighting, screaming, just general kind of displaying, and which means kind of beating your chest, or they would beat their chest. They would stomp on tree buttresses to make loud noises, scream, throw big branches, drag branches. I mean, they really put on a show. And the females were, and this is a fact, this isn't just my own anecdotes. This is all substantiated by, a huge wealth of scientific research on the behavior of chimpanzees. The females are just much more peaceful. They can also be quite physically aggressive. And there are some instances where they've killed other chimps, even babies, in these pretty brutal ways. However, I didn't see any female violence, and I was with them almost every day for 8 months. And I did see a lot of maternal behavior, a lot of carrying and nursing infants and looking for food and sleeping and playing and hanging out with the big males when the females were in estrus and they could get pregnant. So when there were pregnant females around, the males became even more aggressive with each other, fighting for dominance, fighting for rights to mate with the estrus females. And there were the sex differences that I saw in the chimps had so many parallels to human sex differences. And what we share is not human culture, but genes and testosterone, and the same, basically the same body plan with some, a few changes, small genetic changes here and there, but really very similar genes, very similar body plans, no shared culture, but similar behaviors and similar, like the same hormone, which has the same kinds of actions, is present at high levels in males from, a few weeks after conception, is not present in high levels in females. And I didn't know really a lot about testosterone while I was in Uganda, but when I came back, I was obsessed with explaining why the males and females were different in chimps in ways that paralleled human sex differences. And that is what landed me on testosterone. And that was correct, I think, because I think there's a huge amount of explanatory power there. And so I studied testosterone. So I eventually got into the PhD program at Harvard and studied for my PhD. I researched sex differences in testosterone and aspects of cognition, because there are sex differences in the way we think and our abilities actually to perform different kinds of cognitive tasks. And I studied spatial ability, which I wasn't really interested in at the time, but I became interested in it because it's the largest cognitive sex difference that exists. And so I wanted to see how that was related to testosterone. And then I just ended up staying at Harvard and teaching about primarily hormones.
So what is exactly T, and how does it work, and what does it do?
Okay, you're going to have to remind me of those three components. So
okay. What is T? How does it work? Okay. And what does it do?
Thank you. I mean, as I go, just if I forget. Okay. What is it? How does it work? What does it do? So it's a hormone. And if you pause and try to think, oh yeah, I know what that is. Well, do you know what a hormone is? Do you have any idea what that means? So people throw it around. They think they know what testosterone is. And it's not what I think most people think it is. They think it makes men maybe big and strong and have a high libido or something, or has something to do with like having a big, strong erection. That it does have something to do with that. But I'm going to just back up a bit because I want to illustrate a principle about hormones and how they relate to behavior. And I think a helpful way to do that is to think about insulin. So, because insulin is not a controversial hormone, it is so overall, insulin and testosterone are two different types of hormones. And we have probably at this point, we don't even know how many hormones we have, but it could be 80 or more. We're discovering a lot more hormones, especially in the gut, which are really, really interesting, which help us with digestion, other aspects of metabolism that have actions in our brains that shape our behavior in ways we don't understand. But so hormones are molecules produced by different cells in the body, and generally these so these are called endocrine cells. These endocrine cells are clustered in different glands, like the pancreas or the testes or the thyroid or the ovaries. And they produce these either protein molecules or steroid molecules. Steroid molecules are fatty. Proteins are made of amino acids. They're very different, and they have different modes of production and different modes of action. So insulin is a protein hormone produced by the pancreas. Okay. So let's see, I didn't have breakfast. But let's say I had a croissant for breakfast. That's a lot of carbohydrates. Insulin, my pancreas is going to detect that I have high blood sugar, because if I eat a lot of carbohydrates, I'm going to have high blood sugar. So the pancreas, there are cells in the pancreas that detect how much sugar is in the blood. They signal the pancreas to produce this hormone, this protein. It is released into the blood, and it travels around the blood. So this is important because hormones are produced by these glands, and they travel everywhere your blood goes. So steroid and protein hormones, so that is the sex hormones, or I call them the reproductive hormones, and the protein hormones travel everywhere. They're in your body right now, in your brain, in your peripheral system, in the rest of your body.
Is it accurate to say that hormones are messengers of the body?
Yes. And that's what I was taught. And I think sometimes that can be confusing because people don't understand what that means. But I think it's also helpful. And I want to explain. I'll link that's helpful for you to say that right now, because insulin is a messenger to your cells, basically telling them that you've got a lot of glucose, you have high blood sugar. So it's a signal to your cells saying you have to do something about this now. So not all of your cells are able to respond to insulin. Only some of your cells have receptors that interact with the protein hormone. So insulin will interact with the cells that have receptors for it, like in your liver or in muscle. So your muscle cells need glucose to generate ATP and fuel your physical activity. You need energy, right? And glucose can be used to produce energy. So that hormone interacts with insulin receptors. It opens up. So you're going to understand why I'm telling you this long explanation in just a second. But at the same time, right? In order for you to survive, your brain needs to know how you should behave. Should you go find more food right now? Or should you run around and start looking for a mate? Or should you just rest? If you're taking in glucose into your cells, you probably don't need to go look for food right now as a human. Some other animals might, and they would store their food, for instance. But whatever the situation, you need to your body has to signal your brain what the energetic status of energy availability is in your body. You are now taking in energy from food, right? That is a signal. Hey, maybe you can go spend some energy. You don't right now have to go seek more food. In other words, you're not hungry. You just ate. Your blood sugar's high. It's being stored. It's being burned. So insulin actually also gets into your brain. But when it's in your brain, it's not in there causing glucose to be taken up into cells. It is signaling a part of your brain called the arcuate nucleus and telling your brain what is going on. It's inhibiting hunger. Okay, so you have a connection between the energetic status and needs of your body and your brain, which alters your psychology. If your insulin is low because glucose is low, then you're going to be kind of dissatisfied and maybe on edge, and you're going to be looking for food. Like you're not even going to be able to pay attention if you're really hungry to other things in your environment because insulin is low, which triggers hunger in your brain. And that is an incredible mind-body connection right there. And I think everyone can understand how that works with food and insulin. So I'm taking a long time with it because now we're switching from energy and survival to reproduction, which in an evolutionary context is more important, especially for men in some sense, than survival. So you as a man, as a male animal, would be more apt to risk survival in order to reproduce, because the goal from an evolutionary point of view is to leave as many copies of your genes in the next generation as possible. And you could do that in a shorter time than a female could do. You could maximize, that's called maximize your reproductive success by taking risks. So if we move from kind of energy and survival to reproduction, then we can start thinking about estrogen and testosterone as sort of setting the body up to reproduce, and there are very different needs there, obviously, for males and females, but then signaling what is going on in the body to the brain to motivate different kinds of behaviors that are contingent upon the environment. Just like hunger is also contingent in many ways upon what is available in the environment, externally and internally. If you're really sick, maybe you're not going to be hungry. So with testosterone, it is a steroid hormone primarily produced by the testes, but unlike insulin, which is produced, from very early development, of course, testosterone is produced at different life stages to develop and maintain and coordinate male reproductive physiology and behavior. And it's a steroid. So what that means is it also goes all throughout the blood and interacts with receptors. But instead of interacting with receptors at the cell surface, like steroid hormones do, like protein hormones do. So protein hormones don't go inside the cell, typically. Steroid hormones just go right through the cell membrane, and they interact with DNA directly. They interact with your genes, and they can increase gene transcription. That means the rate at which proteins are essentially produced from the kind of genetic recipe, or they can decrease that rate. So like you have a little stubble on your face there. That is because you have testosterone, which is converted into dihydrotestosterone, which gets into the cells in your skin and upregulates the proteins that help you produce dark facial hair, and has converted your little vellus follicles into terminal follicles during puberty. Okay. So testosterone, it does something very similar to a hormone like insulin, except it's about maximizing reproduction. And that is converting the energy that you get from food that insulin helps to deal with, using that energy and converting it into offspring as efficiently as possible. What do you have to do? You have to have a certain psychology, just like maybe you get hungry when you have low blood sugar. If you're making sperm, you're going to be have a high libido. And that's testosterone that ensures that you don't have a super high libido if you're not making sperm. If you're a little kid, you're not really, hopefully, interested in sex. If you're sick and your testicular function may be downregulated, your testosterone might be downregulated. Maybe you're not thinking about sex when you're sick. If there are no fertile females around, that is also going to change how testosterone shapes your behavior. So there are very complex relationships between the social environment, the ecological environment, your life stage, and what how testosterone, which I should mention, controls sperm production and gets that going in puberty. But it's also going into the brain and trying to basically coordinate your reproductive behaviors with what's going on in your reproductive system. So like insulin is coordinating what's going on with your energetic status, with your food-seeking psychology and behavior. Testosterone is coordinating reproductive function, including, and really importantly, sperm production with the behaviors necessary to get the sperm to egg, essentially. Sorry, super long answer.
It's perfect. We have plenty of time. I will ask afterwards about the effects, or the effects of testosterone in human bodies through the life of individuals. But before, I would like to talk about sex difference in behavior between men and women related to related to testosterone. So, what kind of differences exist in behavior between men and women related to T? What are the most important differences? Of course, there are plenty of them, and I can imagine after your answer that there's plenty to be said. But what are like the main differences related to T, to levels of T?
Yeah, in humans, we can't do the same kind of research in humans that we can do in non-human animals, where we can manipulate genes and testosterone in males and females and see exactly what the effects are. And there we know that it's sex and aggression. That's it. Those are the big ones. And
sex and aggression.
Sex and physical aggression. So there are different females are extremely aggressive. They can also be very physically aggressive, but because their reproductive success depends more on resources, not mates. They don't need to compete. Their reproductive success doesn't tend to depend on acquiring mates the way it does for males. It's all about relative reproductive success for males, who can from an evolutionary point of view, if you out reproduce competitors, you kind of win that evolutionary game and leave more copies of your genes behind. I just want to say humans are we're exceptional among mammals, because in only 5 or even a smaller percentage of mammals do the males have any investment in their offspring. So in humans, male contributions to offsprings are that is incredibly important in increasing offspring survival and so that increases your reproductive success. You may be able to do better depending on who you are and your environment, sort of competing on the open market for mates, but there's a balance for men where investment in offspring is really important, and that tends to reduce competition in human and men.
Let me ask a question. When you talk about investment in the offspring, are you talking about a different direct investment or indirect investment too? So, for instance, protecting a whole area, space in the jungle would be would be a kind of indirect investment or not?
Yes, that's an excellent, it is really an excellent and sophisticated question. Most people don't appreciate, no, it is. They don't appreciate that, no, it is. I mean, that's not even, a lot of biologists don't even, I don't know, appreciate that, but that there's some controversy actually as to how to think about that kind of investment, which you're 100% right, that like in gorillas, who might protect the area where their offspring are being raised, the male behavior is contributing to their survival. So that's not what I'm talking about. However, I'm open to, that is, it's interesting. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about
So
the first
you're
kind of
talking
investment.
about, so direct investment
Yes.
in caring,
In
caring,
carrying,
actually.
in gathering and providing resources for the mother or the offspring, can translate to increased survival for the offspring. And, in men, that can be any physical contact can be very important for men. And we can talk about that later because that has effects on male testosterone when they're fathers. But in almost all mammals, the big point is that males provide the sperm only, so really can do quite well reproductively if they are excellent competitors. And depending on there's huge variation across species concerning the extent to which physical aggression pays reproductive benefits. In some, it's really not about physical aggression. It might be mostly intimidation without a lot of actual aggression, or coloration, or singing, or mate choice, like in the peacock, which is not super physically aggressive, but competes using other means. So the point is that in humans, that kind of male-male competition for mates that involves physical aggression is dramatically reduced compared to species that gain really potent benefits from male-male competition. So that's just something to keep in mind. However, even though males can get along with each other in ways that might be surprising compared to males of other species, there's still a huge sex difference in physical aggression. And that was your question. If you look at the data around the world, the murders are almost all committed, 95 or upwards % of murders, violent physical assaults, rapes. It's not that 95% of men are committing these crimes. It's that of these crimes, they are overwhelmingly committed by men. Women commit a lot of crimes too, but the type of crime that they commit tends to be crime that does not risk their physical safety. And one evolutionary explanation for that difference is that these psychological dispositions for this kind of physical competition and physical risk-taking have evolutionary and biological underpinnings that are sort of executed by sex differences in testosterone. And that's what I argue in the book, is that the differences in sexual psychology and behavior, which is preference for number of sexual partners. Men have a much higher preference. They want to have sex with more women than, or more partners. It doesn't even have to be, women. It could be, women or men, but men want more partners overall. And gay men do have more partners because they don't presumably have women putting on the kind of sexual brakes. They're with other men who also want a high number of sexual partners. And other evidence for this is that women who are sexually attracted to other women, lesbians, some people would say queer, this terminology is changing, but what I'm saying is men who are attracted to men tend to have more sexual partners. Women who are attracted to and sexually intimate with other women tend to have fewer sexual partners. So here it's kind of like we're seeing the sex differences in sexual nature without being kind of contaminated by the expectations from the opposite sex. And we have very good evidence that when people change their testosterone level from female to male levels or male to female levels, their sexual psychology changes in the predicted direction, where, if women transition to live as men, their sex drive goes way up. And if men transition to living as women, theirs tends to go way down.
So T is related with higher sex drive and higher physical aggression. This would be the summary.
Yes. And the evidence, well, no, I paused because I think while the evidence for sexual behavior and sexual psychology is extremely clear, the evidence for aggression, well, crystal clear in non-human animals. And we have the same pattern, a very similar pattern in humans in terms of aggression as we see in non-human animals. We don't have the same kind of direct evidence that we do with changing testosterone levels and changing sex psychology.
What do you mean?
And so we don't, first of all, most men are not physically aggressive. So it is difficult to assess changes in physical aggression, especially extreme physical aggression, given that the number of men who are routinely physically aggressive is extremely low. So that's one thing. What we do have is evidence from females who are exposed to high levels of testosterone in uterine development, because that impacts the brain and is thought to masculinize the brain. Those girls are more aggressive in terms of preferring like rough play, like tackling, like boys love to tackle each other and wrestle as play. Girls who have unusually high testosterone in utero show much higher rates of that kind of preference for that kind of play as kids. So, well, yeah, the evidence is not quite as strong for the aggression link in humans. Although, male aggression does go up at puberty, female aggression does not. I mean, more serious physical aggression. So we have correlational evidence, but we don't, we don't have experimental evidence the way we have with sex and libido.
Yeah. So I had a question prepared that has to do with what we are talking about right now, which is, where does evidence or proof come from in your field, and how evidence is built? Maybe you can explain the different kinds of evidence or experiments that you run in biology and endocrinology to come to conclusions.
Yeah. So
sorry, let me say something. I ask this because, nowadays with COVID and, the kind of controversial scientific issues that we are living, many people ask to themselves how scientific proof or evidence is built. So I think that it may be interesting to take some time to talk about this.
Yes, although it is tough here.
Yeah, I imagine.
It's a complex question because we can't do experiments. So what you would want to be able to do to definitively show that you can't, to show, actually, you can't do this. And even if you could, you wouldn't be able to show it. If you wanted to show that the sex differences that I'm talking about are definitely due to sex differences in testosterone, you would have to control the environment, which we can do in animals and we cannot do in humans. The problem with drawing these very firm, solid, saying that we have this firm, solid evidence in humans is that we do develop and live in these highly, highly gendered cultures. So you cannot tease apart the influence of biology and culture. But to me, that is the evidence right there, in a way, is that we do live in a gendered culture. There are gendered cultures. Every culture is a gendered culture, maybe in a slightly different way, but with some very strong similarities across cultures. So the evidence that we have, I can describe the evidence we have from, the kind that I just talked about, where people have unusually or atypical hormone levels at different life stages, and how their behavior is different from what we would expect given their sex and how they're raised. So that's one kind of evidence that I can talk about. But I think even the more powerful evidence is using this sort of comparative evolutionary perspective. So this isn't experimental evidence. This is kind of logic, in a way, evolutionary logic, and thinking about how humans might be different from non-human animals. And if we understand how natural and sexual selection operate, we have the principles, like the core principles of these forces that act upon us as they, in many ways, as they do in non-human animals that have shaped our bodies and brains over evolutionary history. And we think about the reproductive and survival challenges that we have faced over human evolutionary history and that other animals face. And there are so many parallels and connections and similarities in terms of male and female behavior and everything we know about what testosterone does, all the evidence that we do have in terms of blocking testosterone in adult men who may be undergoing treatment for prostate cancer. We know that their sex drive drops. We have some evidence also that they feel less angry or aggressive. We know that when females take testosterone, their sex drive goes up. We know that alterations in testosterone in the womb can result in differences in behavior in the direction that you would predict. And all of the patterns that we observe kind of map onto what we would expect given evolutionary theory, sexual selection in particular, and patterns that we see in non-human animals. The complexity comes in when we consider the power of human culture in shaping behavior, which is immense. So while I would argue that heightened propensity for aggression in males has an evolutionary and hormonal origin, I also strongly argue that culture is the solution to controlling the expression of that behavior or modifying the expression of that behavior, as it is in non-human animals, in a way that if there's like a dominant male around, a subordinate male, say chimpanzee, is not going to go around being super aggressive because he knows he's going to get his ass kicked by the dominant male. That is a environmental check on that animal's aggression. That's a social check on that animal's aggression. We have the same thing in humans, and that's natural, that our cultural norms are incredibly powerful in shaping these sex differences in terms of what is permissible, how behavior can be expressed. We have marriage norms, we have promiscuity norms, we have violence norms and laws, and we have religion. All of this stuff makes a huge difference. But we still have the signal through the noise, which is in every culture. Little boys do rough and tumble play way more than girls. And that's also what we see in non-human animals. And that's because that is practice. It's fun, motivated practice for male-male competition and status competition in adults. And males need that more than females. So this, I'm just throwing at you the kind of evidence that we would use in evolutionary biology to try to understand the origins of human behavior. I think the misunderstandings come in when people want to ascribe a certain aspect of behavior, the complex behavior, say, that is shared across cultures, to culture or inherited biology. It doesn't work like that. Is gendered behavior, it's expressed in a gendered environment, but that doesn't mean that it is a product solely of the environment or of culture. And it also doesn't mean it's a product solely of genes and hormones. It is heavily influenced by both. But the question that needs to be answered is why do we have these gendered cultures that share similar traits across cultures and with non-human animals? Why do we have these broad patterns of sex differences in the first place? And my view is that it's because we are animals who are subject to sexual selection, and we share with these non-human animals testosterone and estrogen and sex differences in these hormones that direct the development of the body and the brain in ways that maximize reproductive success. And testosterone is what helps males do that. And they need different strategies on average than females do.
So you are just warning against reductionism.
Yes.
In a way, and so the kind of evidence that you thought to sum up, there would be like two big chunks of evidence. direct evidence from evolutionary biology in animals, in other species, and then like smart experiments in people, in humans, messing with T and hormones that you can use to extrapolate some kind of consequence or conclusion to the rest of the people.
Sure. Yeah.
I said it
natural.
Right.
No, you did. You're great. You're great. I would say there's natural variation in exposure to these hormones. The early development piece is incredibly important, those differences in utero, because they have permanent actions on the brain. So there's this natural variation. And then there's, I hesitate to call it experimental variation, but it's akin to experiments where people are altering for medical reasons, for gender transitions, their hormones dramatically. And all of the evidence we have is consistent with the idea that testosterone shapes these basic sex differences.
Okay, and so I don't know if we will bore people, but I am really interested in asking more questions about biology. So in the beginning, man and woman are the same, like a fertilized egg, right?
Oh, and, male and female. Male and female.
Sorry, male and female, of course. I'm sorry. So what role does T play in sexual differentiation through the life of a person, in pregnancy, in utero, adolescence, parenthood? Like, what are the highlights of the effects of T in people?
Yeah, there's no way this is boring. This is like the coolest thing. I mean, it's amazing because this is like early in development, say 5 weeks. Okay, I had a boy. I'm pregnant and I got a tiny little nugget, not even a nugget, super small. And 5 weeks along, he has a genital tubercle. Okay, just this little nub where his penis is now, basically. He won't, whatever. And if I had a girl, she'd also have this little nub. And so there'd be like this little nub of skin that can become, essentially, it's more complicated, but the clitoris or the penis. It's the same structure. And there's like genital folds that can become either labia or scrotum. So you have these same structures that will go one way or the other, depending on the presence of testosterone. Either it's there or it's not. And or it's present at the sort of male typical level, or maybe there's not quite enough to kind of develop typical male genitalia. Without it, the structures stay kind of like they are at the start. They just get a little bigger and develop, but they don't like change as dramatically as they do in a male. Okay, but now I'm going to back up. So that happens a little further down the road in fetal development. The first thing that happens this is the big step. You have, similar to having that little nub that can go either way, one structure that can go in the male or female direction. It doesn't make you male or female, I should say. You can be a female, but you had a lot of testosterone and you end up with what looks like a penis. It's not actually a penis, but it looks like one. Okay, but how do you sort of get to be male or female? You can have a Y chromosome and end up as female, just FYI. And some animals don't even have sex chromosomes, or they certainly don't have our sex chromosomes. Some have temperature-dependent sex determination. So, but in mammals, the males have the Y chromosome, and the Y chromosome has a little gene on it, and that is the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome. That little gene produces the protein SRY. That when that protein is expressed in the similar structures, which are undifferentiated gonads. So just like that tubercle can go either way, you have gonads that can go in the male or female direction. Sort of one one pair of gonads go either in the ovary direction or in the testes direction. And similarly, it's if there is no SRY gene and protein, they go in the female direction towards ovaries. And if SRY is present on the Y chromosome and it's being produced and it's being expressed in those gonadal cells, then testes develop. And if testes develop and they develop properly, then they start secreting testosterone. Then the testosterone goes to act on that little genital tubercle and the genital folds and the internal structures that most people are bored with. Then you go in the male direction, and male reproductive structures and physiology will develop. So that's all happening really early in the first couple months in utero. And what's interesting is at the same time, that testosterone is being produced by the little fetal testes to develop this reproductive capacity and these reproductive structures. It's also getting into the brain because it's a steroid. It just goes everywhere. It gets into the brain. And we know this 100% very clearly in non-human animals. And we have indirect evidence, I would say, of this in humans from some of the situations I just described. But the hormone gets it. We know that it gets into the brain, and we know it has actions in the brain early in development that are very much like what we see in male, say, primates or rodents. And that is it masculinizes the brain, meaning it alters neural development and pruning, and sort of sets the stage permanently for male typical behavior that are necessary for male reproductive strategies, which means on average, again, kind of an increased physical risk taking is a big one. And we see that in kids. So we see these sex differences in kids all over the world. And the only way to explain the consistency of these sex differences is to understand that testosterone has already masculinized the brain in utero. And these are on average.
How do you measure risk taking
in kids?
Yes.
Yeah, risk taking is there are different there's no one way to measure it. Well, the best research that we have is on rough and tumble play and sex differences in rough and tumble play, and how that is predicted by differences in testosterone exposure. We don't have perfect ways to measure prenatal testosterone, but so that's why we use we do these studies on people who have difference. We know that they have certain differences or disorders where they produce more testosterone than would be typical for their sex. And then we see the effects on rough and tumble play, which are very consistent.
Okay, so we were back to the masculinization of the brain.
Yeah. Oh, so that's just occurring in that stage one. We've got masculinization of the reproductive structures and the brain. Then we have testosterone goes up after birth in males in the first 3 months. There's like this mini puberty. It gets very high. People don't really know what that is all about. It seems like it's a second masculinization stage. It might have some sort of impact on penis growth. So people are very interested in that. Then these, and we don't have high reproductive hormones in females. They do not need at that stage estrogen to develop normally. And then we have the quiescent stage when sex hormones are low. Then in puberty, the body is elaborating those reproductive structures, obviously, for anyone who's been through puberty, you know what I'm talking about, but everything is developed and elaborated and sperm production starts. And testosterone is very high at that stage. It gets into the brain and it is nudging male behavior around in a way to take advantage of the fact that you're now producing sperm. The body wants you to use the sperm. Just like if you're taking in glucose, the body does want you to go spend some energy doing something adaptive. And so there's a similar system happening where testosterone is working very hard to regulate your physical, coordinate all these huge changes in your body. So you're moving from slow childhood growth to this transitional period where so many different aspects of development and your physical self and psychological self have to be coordinated. So a steroid hormone that can go everywhere, change how genes are expressed and have very long-term actions, unlike neurotransmitters that have, produced like that and have very quick actions. So neurotransmitters, these longer-term changes that are, can be permanent, are due to steroid hormones. So that's what's happening in puberty, is this further development and then maintenance of reproductive function, of sperm production, and that's constantly being coordinated in the social environment. That's very, very important. That's a hugely important piece of what testosterone is doing. It helps individuals be very sensitive to their social environment in terms of social status, especially for teenagers. It's not always about the sex. A lot of it is about status for males and females. And that is expressed in very different ways. But at that stage for males, this is a reproductive strategy. Achieving high social status, it's clear in non-human primates in a way it might not be as clear in humans. High status males do better reproductively. So we do have a psychology that is geared towards opportunities to increase status and to really being sensitive about where you are in the hierarchy in any given cultural environment, how possibly to ascend that hierarchy, how to obtain resources. And I think it's a little, it's later that the real libido comes in. And that's kind of interesting. And so the competition there, and it plays out in our environment in ways that are different than obviously in our ancestral environment, but it's still like super competitive environment, especially for males. There's a huge interest in sports and doing well in sports and watching sports and talking about sports and for instance, and I think that's really interesting. Females are also super competitive and interested in sports, and but there are some important differences in the kinds of sports, the level of physical risk that is involved in a particular sport, and so that's what's going on at puberty. Sorry, and there are also permanent neural changes that testosterone appears to, and this is research that's really exciting, but it's thought that this is a sort of second organizational period. The development in utero is called the organizational period, as far as setting down kind of the neural stage for adult development. Sorry, the neural stage for reproductive behavior in adulthood. And the idea is that in puberty, the testosterone is responding to the environment in a way to affect neural development at that stage in a way that's responsive to your history and your environment and your condition. And I think I just lost my train of thought. So the idea is that testosterone is then acting on the same kinds of neural structures that were masculinized in utero, and it's acting on those structures to kind of upregulate the kinds of behaviors that you would need to maximize reproduction. And the idea with aggression is that testosterone seems to be lowering excuse me, the bar for the expression of aggression. It doesn't cause it. Sorry, it doesn't cause it. It kind of makes it more likely in the certain environmental circumstances or cultural circumstances, more likely than it would be for a woman. I just talked for way too long.
No,
I
it's
did.
perfect.
Okay.
I want to ask if there are other, moments in our lives that are important, maybe parenthood or, the old age.
Puberty is important because it is a period of kind of working out the social hierarchy, where you fit in the social hierarchy, what your kind of game is going to be. I had an old boyfriend who used to say that, be like, what's his game? Anyway, for sort of working all that out, what your sexual nature is like, sexual orientation even. And then there's the period of kind of competing for mates, and maybe you get into a relatively permanent mateship and you pair up, right? So even in non-human animals, like in the book I write about birds. I, first of all, love birds, but what's cool about birds is there's a lot of research on testosterone and competition and parenting in birds, because there's a lot of male parental investment in birds. So when the females are kind of fertile and they're in the spring and they're competed over by the males come first in the spring and the migration to set up their territory. So they're competing to basically get resources to attract females. They have something like a status hierarchy, but they'll compete, and the males who are healthiest, have high testosterone, have the brightest colors and the best songs, will and can get the best territory. That's very important. Will then be able to acquire a mate, and they'll get the best mates, the healthiest females. And so their testosterone is high at that point in their breeding season. Outside of breeding season, they don't even have any. They don't make sperm. They're not competing because there's no females to get pregnant. In breeding season, testosterone goes up. They fight with each other. They acquire a mate. Once they acquire a mate, everybody's testosterone drops, right? So you've got this whole sort of community of, say, song sparrows in a given area. Most of them, once they've paired up, their testosterone is going to drop. But when the females they're paired with, after they lay their eggs and they come back into fertility, the male's testosterone rises again because they start cheating on their mates, basically, and competing to impregnate somebody else's mate and take care of their own mate and kids. So it's a little complicated. So there are times when their testosterone will go back up, but when they have little chicks in the nest, their testosterone drops. And we know this now from experiments, it is necessary that their testosterone drop for them to be good dads, to go out back and forth all day long, looking for worms and spiders and whatnot to feed their kids. And if testosterone is raised when they're supposed to be taking care of their kids and devoted to their partner and being a good dad, etc., if you raise testosterone, they neglect their kids and just go trying to pick fights with other males and find, defend territory and find mates, but their kids die. So it's not a good reproductive strategy to just have high testosterone all the time if you're a member of a species where male investment in your kids increases your reproductive success. So in humans, that is what we see. It's called the challenge hypothesis. And it's very interesting that it seems to apply to humans, that once you've paired up and you no longer have to feel that you're competing all the time for a mate, you'll see on average, depending on how invested you are in your mate, you'll have a testosterone drop, but you'll have an even greater drop when you have kids if you're invested physically in those kids. So, the assumption is, we don't know for sure, but the assumption is that this is a strategy that helps you focus on the stimuli that are most relevant to your reproductive success. When you have kids, the stimuli are your kids, and they trigger hormonal changes in you, including a drop in testosterone, an increase in prolactin and oxytocin, that help you focus on them, and you get pleasure and reward from physically interacting with your kids, augmented by these hormonal changes that are totally due to the environment, totally due to what's happening outside of your body, and have a really dramatic impact on your behavior. And yeah, so that's a super important life stage. And it depends on, this physical time with the kids. So if you're out working and making money and like providing for your kids, and your wife or husband or whoever you're raising kids with, if you're providing but not spending time physically with your kids, we do not see the same change. So it's a very interesting reproductive strategy, and it really shows how profound an impact the external environment is on your endocrine system. It's not just your endocrine system imposing or influencing behavior in a vacuum. The social environment's incredibly important.
Before you said twice, I think, that there's different differences in brains in female and male human brains.
Yes. Yeah.
Is
but
that
don't make
so?
me...
And I, as far as I know, an expert can, recognize
expert computer.
An expert computer. Okay.
Computer program. No, seriously, it's very hard. Yes, maybe a human can, but that's not as accurate as the computer program can do it, can sex a brain. I think it's like 90%. I'm not sure what the percentage, 95% accuracy, something like that.
So you can sex a brain with a computer and a software, but does that mean something or not? I mean, do we have really different brains, or do we have just, like one square centimeter that is different and that makes a visual pattern that a computer recognizes, and that's all?
Yeah. So this is not my big area of expertise. I know something about this. I know something about testosterone. So we don't, again, have experiments. So in humans, so we cannot say with certainty, like we can in non-human animals, that testosterone increases or decreases a specific part of the brain in humans. We know that there are some sex differences in the brain in humans, but we cannot say that they're necessarily attributable to testosterone differences, because we are, we have different gendered experiences from birth, right? So that's very hard to make that claim. However, in non-human animals, we know that the nature of the sex differences is that there are many, many small differences in the brain that are caused by testosterone exposure. So one of the differences is in the way that neurons communicate with each other. There's something on neuron. So there are these structures. The details are not super important, but there are structures on neurons that called spines and shafts, and they affect how neurons communicate with neighboring neurons, which is very important. So these are communication pathways in the brain, and these are extremely small structures on different cells. And we know, for one thing, that testosterone, for instance, affects in a sex-specific way the ratio of spines to shafts. And this actually makes a difference in how the neurons communicate. But this isn't a good example, I think, because it's a very small, subtle difference, but it's widespread in the brain. So it's not something, as far as I understand, that you can just see. There is a structure that you can see very easily that differs in non-human animals, and that's called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. And this is a really important part of the brain, of the hypothalamus, which is directly related to reproductive behavior, especially sexual behavior. And we know that higher testosterone levels lead to a male typical, it's called the SDNPOA, lead to a male typical larger size by a lot in non-human animals. It depends on the species, but it sort of masculinizes, enlarges that structure. and without testosterone, you get a much smaller structure, and the size of the structure predicts male typical sexual behavior, which in rodents would be like the individual mounts as the dominant sexual behavior, instead of lordosis, which is sort of the receptive pose in rodents. And you can control that not just by changing testosterone levels. We know that the way that testosterone is shaping sexual behavior is to a significant extent by modifying this neural structure. Humans have an analogous neural structure that also shows the same kind of sex difference, not as large of a sex difference, but a consistent sex difference. That's it's called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. So we know that that is different between the sexes. It also differs in humans. It hasn't, to my knowledge, been as clearly related to sexual behavior, but that's, again, not an area that I know quite as much about.
I would like to talk about science and ideology and politics, but before, let me ask another definition question. What, according to modern biology, how do we even define male and female?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a question a lot of people are asking right now. And what we want to remember is that this is not unique to humans. So I think when we think about humans and we talk about male and female, there's so much cultural baggage that those terms are loaded with. It can be difficult to describe someone who might think of themselves as very feminine, or they even think of themselves as a woman, but they have a male body. They're actually male. That can be, hard to talk about for some people, or hard to acknowledge. So I want to
Carole, just to make something clear. So to begin with, what you would say is that what is male or female is the body. There's something like male and female bodies according to modern biology.
Well, but it's not just the body. It's not just the body, because for all the reasons I just described, generally, so male, let's see. Yeah, I just want to,
the body and behavior, of course. No,
well,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
go on, and we'll see. We'll see if we get to a clear definition.
Yes, I would like. So let me start over. So male and female in organisms, in sexually reproducing organisms, the definition is that the organism that there are two reproductive categories. This is what it is. There's two reproductive categories in nature. And the way the two categories are organisms that produce small mobile gametes, generally mobile gametes, lots of small mobile gametes, or fewer, larger, more energetically costly immobile gametes. And there's, I don't want to go into all the different kinds of organisms, sexually reproducing organisms there are, but there are no other reproductive categories. It's all about the gametes or the sort of design plan for the gametes. So the rest of the organism's development usually takes into account, in a very strong way, the types of gametes that it will be producing at, say, in more complex organisms, sexual maturity. Okay. So we call the organisms that produce the small gametes, which are sperm generally, and we can just stick with mammals right now because that's easy. The ones that produce sperm, or designed to produce sperm, which means having testes, or the sort of design plan to develop testes, because things can go wrong, or you're gonna have a little kid who doesn't produce sperm, and people say, well, then that person isn't male. It's really about the direction that the organism is developing in. Sperm equals male, eggs equals female. That is a binary distinction. Everything else is on a spectrum. The rest of the traits that are associated with being male or female are not binary. In fact, I'm not sure there's any other trait that is. So if we look at mammals, we can look at humans. It's easy because even the sex chromosomes aren't binary. There's many different sex chromosome combinations that are not XX or XY that still yield a male or a female. And there are many different types of genitalia, as I just described, that the genitalia development is on a spectrum. So it's not, it's not true. And it's not even true that all males have high testosterone at puberty or have high testosterone in utero. All of that stuff, especially gender behavior, especially sort of feeling socially more like a woman or more like a man or more like a girl or more like a boy, that, is related to sex, but there's a huge amount of wiggle room there for all of these physical and psychological and behavioral traits, especially in humans. And I just want to say there are, like in fish, there's many fish that are sequential hermaphrodites that might start out female, for instance, producing female gametes, and then transition later based on the social circumstances to male, producing sperm. There are simultaneous hermaphrodites like flatworms. They're producing eggs and sperm at the same time. So, but the point is, there's still only male and female. There's just different ways of getting there. And there's no other gamete besides basically, ultimately, sperm and eggs. So that's why we have male and female.
So if you believe in the theory of evolution and in the importance of reproduction to mix our DNAs, biology observes that there are two kinds of gametes across all species or all sexual reproductive species, and calls one kind of gamete the male gamete and the other one the female gamete, and organizes organisms within species around this binary categorization.
Yeah, in terms of body and behavior.
Okay.
Yep.
So this would be like the minimal definition of male and female, and then the rest is on a spectrum. Could you explain, or develop what a spectrum means? Does that mean that there's nothing real about males and females but gametes, or does that mean that simply we have to understand that there's a spectrum and therefore you cannot think in binary terms, but more in spectrum terms? I do not know how to say this better than this.
Okay, no, this is great. So I am married to a philosopher who has recently, or in the last few years, gotten into sex and gender. And it's been extremely helpful to interact with a philosopher about these questions. And there's no firm answer to, I don't think, your question, but I think what is helpful is I did dive into a little bit this idea of essentialism, because this comes up in my area a lot, especially as a criticism to the kind of ideas that I am arguing for, that I am essentializing sex. And I guess I do essentialize sex by because I do believe that the one essential property that a female needs to have is the design plan to produce eggs. The one essential property that a male must have is a design plan to produce sperm. I don't believe there are any other essential properties. I had to spend a long time to understand what an essential property actually is. It has something to do with a requirement for membership in a particular category. I might have that wrong, and some philosopher is going to tell me I do. So apart from the gamete, because that is the definition of sex, I don't think there's anything else that is required for membership in a particular sex category. So when I say there's a spectrum, I mean, so some people argue that sex itself is on a spectrum, but I do not agree, because there's no spectrum of gametes. There are two. There's no, having a unusual combination of sex chromosomes. Like there's something called Klinefelter's syndrome, where males have to call this, although I don't agree, an intersex disorder, and say, look, this person is neither male nor female because they don't have XY. And that means sex is on a spectrum, because look at their sex chromosomes, because there's all these different combinations. That has nothing to do with it. The sex doesn't require a particular combination of sex chromosomes. And as I said, some organisms don't even have sex chromosomes, yet they still produce sperm or eggs. So the spectrum to me is like gender expression. You can have any, you can move from feminine to masculine, but maybe even spectrum isn't the right word, because that suggests that there are these two tails, feminine and masculine. But now we see there's all kinds of sex role expression, whatever you want to call it, that seems sometimes totally unhinged from actual sex. There's also sex hormones. There's no binary classification of, males. A male is no longer a male if he doesn't have high testosterone. What if he doesn't have any testosterone at all? Is he still a male? Or if a female has very high testosterone? Well, it doesn't invalidate membership in the sex category. It just means that there's complexity in the traits that are associated with sex and how they're expressed. Even genitalia, that genital tubercle, can stay what looks like a small clitoris, and there is a spectrum of penile development that is dependent on testosterone exposure. It is on a spectrum from genital tubercle to, fully developed penis. And that is related strongly to sex, but it's not either or. That is on a spectrum. So I hope that is clear. Same thing with sexual orientation or anything that co-varies with sex.
It's very clear, and it's also surprising, since I think that you are known for having an essentialist point of view on sexes, at least to a certain extent. And what you're saying here is that sex is almost something nominal, that sex is only about gametes, and that the rest is, not that clear, not binary.
Because although these other traits are on a spectrum, the possibilities are on a spectrum. If you were to do some complex statistics on what traits are expressed in males and what traits are expressed in females, you would find that 99% of the time, 99.99% of the time, whatever it is, males are going to have a penis, have a predisposition that's for physical aggression that's higher than the female. That won't be 99.99, but you'll get a clustering of traits in males that you don't get in females, and that is fairly predictable. And that's why I think sex is important, because on average you get these clusterings, although we have to appreciate that you don't always, and there's a huge amount of variability. But that's why some people are fighting for the retention of the understanding of what sex is, because it is valuable in terms of predicting behavior in ways that, some people want to have, female only spaces to protect women. And that's why I think that most of the time, sex isn't super important, but sometimes it is. So we need to have a clear definition.
Okay, I think that we will come back to this question, but let me go to another point, which is that you say that science, and especially biology and the kind of biology that you do, is under siege by ideology. Is that correct to say so? I mean,
Yes, definitely.
Yes, okay. So what exactly do you refer to? Who is leading what kind of attacks? Why do these people or these groups run this kind of attacks? What scientific truths do you think are important to defend and are under attack?
Describing it as an attack makes it sound, pernicious, I think, or
okay.
And I think that people who I disagree with are doing their best to support the rights of women, gender minorities, and I think they might see the science I think they do see the evidence in a very through a different lens, perhaps. And I do think that lens is a lens of some kind of social justice, which I am completely for. How I'm for, equality and dignity and healthcare for everyone and equal rights and all of that. And I should just say the populations a lot of students I've worked with over the years at Harvard are interested in my classes because I teach about vulnerable populations of humans who have differences that can be very difficult and painful and challenging socially or medically. So I have a huge amount of
But maybe draw some context. But draw some context, maybe, because I don't think that here in Spain or in Latin America, people will exactly know what the debate is about. So, what claims do you think are under siege
I'm getting there.
or under discussion?
Sorry,
okay.
What I'm pushing back against is what I see as an effort to undermine really solid scientific evidence, evolutionary theory, and what we know about how hormones work. Testosterone is a particular target. I think that it is mostly a certain strain of feminism or feminist work that much of the time isn't coming out of the sciences. It's coming out of women and gender studies departments, history of science departments, philosophy. There is an effort to, I think, undermine the kind of science that I'm talking about because it can be seen as interfering with say women's rights or female equality or even transgender rights. So it's the idea that talking about male and female somehow is damaging to transgender rights, or talking about testosterone and what it does in men is somehow damaging to women's rights, or that I'm interacting with Cordelia Fine right now, who is a scholar in Australia, who says that this kind of talk squashes the hopes for sex equality, talking about the power of testosterone. And I totally disagree. I think the way to achieve equality, the way to achieve human rights, the way to achieve rights and dignity for transgender people is to be honest about the science, to do good science, to debate openly the science, and to understand how we work and understand how society works, understand our bodies and our influences. And that, to me, is the best way to move the world in a direction that we want to go. And biology is not destiny. So I hope I've given some examples of cases where, just say, knowing that testosterone might increase a propensity for physical aggression, that's not evidence that should be silenced. That's something we desperately need to understand, because we already know that culture holds the key. We already know that if we want to reduce murder, say, then we need to know what we're dealing with, and we need to know what kind of laws and cultural norms, how to support boys, whatever it is we have to do. We need to understand that, and that's a reality that we have to understand. So just having a biological predisposition for something does not mean that that will be expressed. It means that it will possibly be expressed if given the cultural or social or environmental kind of latitude, or the right conditions are present.
But I don't, sorry, Carole, but I don't even get what the problem is. What are you saying specifically that is making some people angry? What claim?
Okay, male and female.
Yeah.
First of all, saying male and female are real.
Saying male and female are real. Okay.
Yes, that is one thing that is people have had a very hard time with. And the other thing is just everything that I've said during this interview, which is that I think the sexes are different, not just because of culture, but in a very important way because of biology, particularly testosterone. That for many people is threatening, because to them, it suggests that there's nothing we can do to change these cultural norms, to change the way that gender is expressed within cultures. Because supposedly I'm saying that, look, this is in your genes, so there's nothing we can do. A, it's good because it's natural. B, we're stuck with it. Whatever it is, we're stuck with it. But both of those things are wrong. Just because something is natural does not mean it's good. It just means it is. We figure out what we want to do with it. And the second thing is, no, we're not stuck with anything. Like, I mean, maternal behavior, maternal instinct is real. That's in my genes. I hope that reasonable people can agree that maternal, there was just an article in the New York Times, has a maternal instinct, and that it is genetic in some sense. But that doesn't mean that anyone has to be a mom. It doesn't even mean that being a mom is good. It doesn't even mean that everyone is automatically, who has a baby, is just going to know how to take care of their baby in a certain way. It's a predisposition for a certain set of behaviors given the right, quote, right environmental circumstances. If you don't want to be a mom, you don't have to. If you don't want to get in a bar fight or kill anybody, you don't have to. If your culture doesn't allow you to rape, then rape is going to go way, way down. And we see this across cultures. We know that there are huge differences in mostly male behavior, because it's mostly men who are committing these crimes. But we can see that the expression of these, say, violent behaviors varies hugely by culture. So we're not stuck with anything. So the point is that me saying that sex is real, that biology influences our brains and behavior, it influences sex differences, all of that is distasteful to, it is mostly feminist scholars who want to argue
today,
that patriarchy is responsible for all of this.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that it seems to me that you presented a very reasonable and open-minded and even flexible, I would say, view on sex and environment and culture. But anyway, I wanted to ask you this. Are there other biologists holding very different views and claims than yours?
So that's part of what is really upsetting me these days, is that the journals in the US anyway, the top scientific journals are now requiring, as a publishing standard, at least Nature Human Behavior, for example, is requiring that the research it publishes meets certain standards that basically are not scientific standards. They are social standards about whether or not the findings could potentially harm groups of people based on immutable characteristics such as sex, sexual orientation, race, and some other factors. So like if I did a study and I found, as I did actually for my dissertation, that there are sex differences in cognition, my dissertation was on mental rotation ability, and everybody knows males way outperform females. I don't have any problem saying that. I don't have any problem acknowledging that. I'm interested in it. I want to know why it's the case, what the implications are, how we could reduce this difference if this is desirable in some way. I think it's very important information, but that could be perceived as damaging to women or damaging to girls. And that's the kind of finding that might not be published now. So scientists themselves are, in my view, are becoming increasingly ideologically motivated, not just because they have a particular ideology, but because they know they're not going to advance in their careers or get their articles published if they don't use the accepted words, if they don't find the acceptable results. It's no longer in, I think, North America and other places. It is becoming increasingly difficult to pursue research about human sex differences, to use conventional language like male and female. People who say that sex is binary are getting in trouble and are no longer teaching the kind of courses that I have taught. And yeah, so there are articles by scientists that argue that sex is on a spectrum, that sex is not binary, and that this is the view to hold if you want to support transgender rights, or if you believe that if you even accept that females are different from males, if you want to advance feminist goals. So there are certain kinds of acceptable views, there are unacceptable views, and I increasingly am on the side where what I am talking about is on the side of unacceptable. And it takes like a 2-hour discussion for me to explain everything. But if I just say it, what I said about there being two sexes, like I did say it on a news program, and like a 4-minute news program, I got in a lot of trouble for that. A lot of trouble.
It is also true that you listening to you could also say there are two sexes, but what is important is to understand that there's a spectrum. I mean, it is logical.
I don't think that is what's important about humans, about their behavior and their bodies. So yes, there is but like the spectrum of genitalia, it's super important for people who are different in some way and need to be understood and need to have medical support, need not to be stigmatized. That is super important, and I'm very interested in that. But that is not the same as saying the point that I'm trying to make, which is if we want to understand why people are different on average, males and females, which are real, then it helps enormously to understand what sex is, what testosterone is, and how evolution works.
Okay. I have another question on this same topic, which is the following. You don't really need to deny the biological existence of sex to somehow downsize its relevance in education, laws, etc. Because we come from a history, right, with lots of discrimination. And if, as you say in your book, we are all made of the same stuff and we are so similar in so many ways, we could put less effort, to say so, in dividing humanity into two clear blocks around the concept of sex. I mean, you could argue that what you do in biology and maybe make sense in biology and can inform also politics and the real world, you could argue that it should be translated into other terms, or into it could you could say that we could make less effort in dividing people into male and female, or men and women, because of the history that we have with discrimination. Yeah. So
Yes.
my question is very.
Yeah. No, I understand. I think I understand what you're saying, and I think it's about sex roles and expectations for sex roles that are based on somebody's sex, which are quite constraining for people. So what I've been talking about are average sex differences, patterns that are important to understand. For one reason, because male aggression is a big problem. I mean, that's the main reason, that to me, sex is important, is that there are a lot of problems in the world. And of course, it's not just men or all men, but the kind of violence that I'm talking about is predominantly male initiated, and that we need to understand. Why is that happening? And that is also, there's a threat to women that men don't face there. That's a different kind of threat because we are smaller and weaker and have the kids. Apart from that, there are other issues that to me are less important, but they're very important to some people, like should male-bodied people be allowed to participate in female sports, in the female category in sports, if they identify as female? I don't really take a position on that because that's just not as important to me. But what is important is having the facts and allowing people to have their discussions and debate with the facts. That's why I'm very clear about saying this is female and this is male and they are different. And then you people go decide what you want to do about it. Now, what my actual personal belief is that we should open up gender categories, and we should open up, as I think we are doing, what is culturally acceptable for males and females. Like this is what really it's hard for me to talk about because there's a lot of suffering, especially by boys who are gender non-conforming, who are little boys who want to play with girls or play with dolls, or are not interested in rough and tumble play, because there are a lot of boys like that. Many of them will grow up to be gay, which is interesting. A lot of gay men were gender non-conforming in that way as kids. And to me, that should just be totally fine, because there's a lot of bullying that it can be very, very painful and difficult, especially for little boys. But the same thing is also true, but it's not quite as bad for girls. They're not policed as much this way. But I was kind of a tomboy, but there are some girls who are very masculine as kids or masculine as adults. They don't get bullied quite as much, but it's still painful. Those are the kind of gender expectations that I personally wish would disappear. I think we should have a total flexibility in gender roles in that way. And yeah, sorry, is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Yes, totally. Yes.
Okay. That's my view there. That is my personal view about all this. But then at the same time, that's, what I'm saying is I think those expectations should be extremely flexible. I'm not saying it's wrong also for people to be traditionally masculine or feminine. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but it's that, okay, we can have these traditional sex roles, but we should also be totally open when people deviate from those traditional expectations. But at the same time, sex can be important in prisons. Do we let males into women's prisons if they identify as female? Do non-conforming? Does that mean that they're transgender? How do we understand sex? So for me, the language and the facts are what I focus on, and trying to make those to not dilute the language. If I'm not allowed to say what male and female is, or if people aren't allowed to describe that, I think it messes with power dynamics in the conversation, in the debates about these issues. Everybody should have access to the same facts and at least agree on the language, or we can't even contribute to the conversation about how we feel about these social and political issues.
Let me ask you a personal question, if I may.
Yeah.
You have said that you have been the victim of sexual assault. You have dedicated your entire professional life to teaching. You have worked with lots of trans students and people that you have helped with your knowledge. And you teach one of the highest rated courses, or you teach one of the highest rated courses at Harvard. How do these kind of accusations of anti-feminism or transphobia that you actually received in the US sit with you?
Not well. I mean, it's been awful, and it's just made me really sad to work really hard and care about these populations of people, and think that I had supportive colleagues and friends, and to have all that kind of crumble very quickly has been awful. I would like to make clear that I'm not the only person here that this is happening to in the States and in the UK to a certain extent, but it's much worse here. I think I've been in contact with a lot of people who have had similar experiences, but much worse. Like I wasn't fired, but there are people who are being fired, or there's been suicides, there's been, protests, and it's a crucial time, I think, in the States, and again, to some extent in the UK. It's a crucial time because academic freedom and free speech and all of that is under attack. And so although this has been painful, like really hard personally and professionally, I think as a scientist, it's super important for me to stand my ground. And as an educator, where are we going if educators, and this is definitely happening. I have so many stories I could tell you. Educators see what happens to people like me, or has happening to other people at other institutions. And they learn what they're supposed to research and what they're supposed to say and not supposed to say. And that's what we're teaching our students. And it's a distortion of science and the scientific method. And we are closing off opportunities to learn about the world. That to me is tragic. So while it's been painful, there's no way I would continue to teach and do my work if I had to compromise on those values. Then what am I even doing in academia? So I will not compromise on those values. And I'm learning a lesson about people and who I know agree with me, who didn't support me or even told me to keep my mouth shut or something like that. So you learn who your friends are and who has integrity and who doesn't, and then you figure out who you want to be around. And so I'm trying to make some changes, but you're right. It's been very painful.
So I have another question, another personal question, actually, but let me make an argument. The right has always used and manipulated, in a way, science to make politics and to justify all kinds of discrimination through centuries, without generating an epidermal reaction from the scientific community. But when the left uses sciences to promote gender equality or to fight against global warming, and when the left deviates a little from science and scientific truths and scientific methods, it looks like the reaction is very quick and epidermic. Is this so, or is this just like my own personal view?
Well, I can definitely comment on the second part. It is we're eating our own here, because Yeah, I'm on the left. I'm pretty far. I used to be anyway, far on the left, but the people who are embracing me happen to be on the right, which it's not, I don't want this to be politicized, but it is. I don't want to be embraced because I'm supporting some anti-trans agenda. And that is a danger, but what do you do in that situation? Do you not speak what you think is the truth? Do you not do your work? Or what I'm trying to do is say, look, there are these facts, but they have these implications, like the implications of the facts aren't what you might think. If that makes sense, like having a biological underpinning of sex differences doesn't mean that men just get to go and cheat on their wives and that should be okay, or whatever it is, it is that you think. Like, of course it doesn't mean that. And so I try to focus on saying, look, these are the facts, but it definitely doesn't mean that any particular behavior is justified or immutable or anything like that. So that's what I try to focus on. But you're right that the left is really, and I think they're complicated reasons, and I think they're evolutionary reasons we can use an evolutionary framework to understand, actually. And there's a lot of good literature on this. The left is eating its own, because if you want to belong to a certain club, or you want to belong to a certain population and be part of it and get benefits of being part of a group, and you want status in the group, you have got to signal that you have the right values. And you've got to punish those who have the wrong values. And that is enhanced by social media greatly. So people who didn't have power before now have a huge amount of power via social media. And that's what's happening around this whole social justice discourse, is that there's a lot of weaponization of social media to kind of gain power and control that discourse. And if you can signal that you have the right values, you get a lot of benefits. Even if it's kind of ridiculous from a scientific point of view, people don't care about that as much anymore. They don't care about the facts as much anymore. They care about doing what is perceived as the right thing in public. And that's too bad.
It's quite impressive that to be a biologist in a huge university in the States, you need to belong to a certain discourse and to a certain group. But what actually happened in Harvard? How the book was received, and what actually happened in the last few months?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it a little bit. The book itself has been received glowing reviews everywhere. And that includes academic reviews in science.
And that is why we bought it, right? I mean, okay. The book is an amazing book, written by an amazing professional, and with the best reviews from the scientific community.
Yeah. Well, and one just came out in one of the top anthropology journals just 2 days ago, Evolutionary Anthropology, and it compares my book to one of the books I went after that like has the right views, the socially condoned views that are picked up by like the New York Times and Washington Post and our big newspapers. So part of this is that the media endorses and trumpets the views that disagree with me. So the newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, was the first review I got, and it was like a dream review. I couldn't have literally dreamt of a better review. I couldn't believe it, so that's considered to be a more conservative newspaper overall. But even in the UK, in this journal, Evolutionary Anthropology, I've had a bunch of academic reviews. They've all across the board been fantastic. And I'm thrilled about that. But then when you get into an academic institution, it is entirely different. So I thought that I took a year off to write it, and then I was gone during COVID, and then I came back. So I had been gone really for 2 years. I mean, I worked through COVID, but I worked through home. And then, so when I came back, everything was different. I thought, oh, I'm going to be, everyone's going to be congratulating me for this book. But that is not how it was. And it's because I talked about the book in a way, without the context, right? And I said there are two sexes. I said it on Fox and Friends, and that's the, super conservative news network. And I said in a small segment, there are two sexes. It's based on the gametes you produce. And then I said right away, but that doesn't really have anything to do with gender expression. We can use everybody's pronouns. We can support everybody's gender identity and gender expression. I was like, these are the facts. And I said, these are the facts of nature. And this doesn't prevent us from treating anyone with respect. However, people went and quoted me on that and cut out the part where I said we can treat everyone with respect, blah, blah, and only quoted me as saying there's male and female. And then somebody in my own department who happened to be a graduate student, but she was the director of I don't know if you guys have this, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So in all the universities, there are these huge infrastructures where it's like 40% or something of the administration in universities. I think there's some huge percent of the administration is devoted to making sure students are not offended, basically, or feel comfortable or safe.
We don't have huge administrations in Spanish universities for this or for nothing else for that matter.
Good. So you focus on research and teaching, because that's not what we do here. We focus on making sure that the little vulnerable students are like carried from their homes into the university and never have to feel offended or like, oh my God, maybe God doesn't exist or something. Like, what if some professor says, they don't believe in God? Or what if I say spectrum and the student is non-binary? I don't know if you have non-binary, but the student thinks they're neither male or female and calls themselves non-binary. And I teach them that male and female are real, and that's all there is. There's nothing intermediate. Now, if that student is offended and they go complain, then the teacher is going to feel, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that because I'm not going to be able to get tenure. Like, that is what's happening here. So, so for me, the graduate student went onto Twitter, and she was the director of our diversity, inclusion, and belonging task force in the department. Most departments have. It's not just the university, it's each department has a group to make sure that people don't say offensive things, to make sure that we have equal representation for
so you can
all identity groups.
Let me just make a joke. You can carry weapons and kill yourself every day of the year, but you can you can use offensive language. It's
you
particular.
Can't offend or upset, teach things that, I mean, you can, it depends. In this case, I did. And it's not that the Harvard itself said, you may not do this. I sort of wish that is what had happened. Instead, this graduate student tweeted that they were appalled and frustrated by my transphobic and dangerous remarks. And she implied I was dangerous to my students and dangerous for the department because of what I said. And she wanted to assure students of all gender identities that our department was actually a safe space, or they were working to make it like a safe space in spite of me. I co-direct the undergraduate program. I have done so for many, many years. I am responsible for the undergrads. And I work with those populations that are gender diverse in particular. So for her to say I'm dangerous was awful. So it went out on Twitter. It got picked up by newspapers all over the world because it went viral. A whole bunch of like big important people got involved and it went viral. So now if you Google me, you'll see that I was accused of transphobia by my own department in this very public way. So what happened, a bunch of stuff happened after that I can't really talk about yet, but that wasn't the only event. But it just became a very bad environment for me because it wasn't as though everybody was like saying, oh no, you're great. We value you. You have every right to teach that. That is not what happened. It was the opposite, in fact. And I just, that's been hard, and I can't say too much more about it right now, but I'm on leave. But one thing that happened is I couldn't teach my lecture course anymore because none of the grad students would serve as my teaching fellows. So I can only teach a big lecture if I have graduate students, which I have always had, teaching, doing the grading and running we have like sections associated with the lectures, which are like discussion sections, and the graduate students run those, but they wouldn't teach for me anymore. So I taught a seminar, which was great. But I couldn't even teach my class. So I'm on leave for complicated reasons. Some having to do with my mental health. Like, it's been brutal.
It seems paradoxical to me, since sex transition seemed like a dream field for a researcher like you, working on T. So just let me ask a question, a very practical question about transitions. What have we learned about T from people who have undergone some kind of sex transition?
That it's super powerful. So, I interviewed 3 trans people for the book, and that chapter on testosterone and transgender people, I wrote largely for transgender people to understand exactly what to expect, how testosterone works. I talked about voice and exactly what happens in the vocal tract, and I talked about hair and height and bones and all kinds of things, and sex and aggression, and how changing testosterone changes all of these things. And the science, in addition to all of the conversations I've had with now many trans people since I've been talking about the book, including detransitioners who, people who transitioned, say it's been females who transitioned and then regretted it and then tried to detransition. And I talked to a non-binary teenager also for the book. And everything I've learned is that it's basically what you expect, that females who take testosterone as part of a gender transition go through something like a male puberty, and their sex drive typically goes up in a way that can be shocking to them and overwhelming. And they're like, feel like, wow, this is what it's like for men. Then they have said, I get it now. I had no idea. And I think that women have no idea what it's like for men to go through the world under relatively high levels of testosterone. So they talked a lot about sex drive. That's substantiated by the scientific literature. Something that I haven't come across in the literature, but I have now heard from multiple transgender people, is that increasing testosterone increased their changed their sexual nature, not just their libido, but their patterns of attraction, so that they became more interested in body parts in a way that seemed dissociated from the whole human being and the relationship. So it's not that that wasn't part of their sexuality, like the relationship, the whole human, that is a part of it, but that there was this whole additional part, which is obsession with boobs and butts and feet or whatever it was, in a way that was like the whole person was almost an obstacle to attaining access to the body, if that makes sense. And that actually changed with the testosterone going up before the body changed at all. Very quickly that changed. And I've had people who lived as women and then transitioned, were on testosterone and then detransitioned, so they could explain it to me when they were not under high testosterone. And they said they became the person they had not, they became a person they had resented when they were living as a woman. They didn't like men staring at their boobs or whatever, and they resented that. And then they started doing something like that after they transitioned themselves. So I thought that was fascinating. In
Okay,
emotion, I should say emotion also changes, like access to a wide range of emotions seems to narrow.
so hormonal therapies are important in transitions. Testosterone is very important in transitions from
Yeah.
female to male.
Yes. Thank you for saying that.
Sorry?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I didn't set that stage properly.
No. Yeah, I mean, it's obvious from what you said, but it's also obvious from practice, right? I mean, from even the laws that we are trying to pass for trans people rights. And so I don't really get how talking about testosterone and explaining how important it is for explaining sex difference can be dangerous for trans rights, since there's laws that we need to pass
Yes.
for the states, and health to protect and to finance transitions, and also hormonal therapies. So
Yeah.
how do you? It seems to me like there's a paradox there.
Okay,
Between,
so there's two things. It's the talk about sex being binary and immutable is important, because that is seen as invalidating the transgender identity, or it can be seen that way. I've talked to many trans people who don't think that. They're like, of course there's male and female. The whole reason I'm transgender is because I don't want to be the sex that I am, basically. So that's one part of it. The testosterone part can be problematic because it is so powerful that the law has to take into account what happens that is irreversible and potentially damaging to sexual function and to fertility for a female, for instance, to take high levels of testosterone, or for a male to block his testosterone, especially if that's started in puberty, like before one's natural puberty has completed. Because if you don't experience your natural puberty, you do not develop your sex organs, you do not develop the capacity to produce gametes, and you may not, and you most likely do not have the capacity to have an orgasm. So the problem is that when children, essentially, and their families are making these decisions, it's the issue of informed consent comes up. So if I'm talking about testosterone and puberty blockers, which are drugs given to children to stop their natural puberty from happening, most of those kids who will block their puberty will go on to take testosterone or block testosterone in essence. And those facts they're very serious. These are very, very serious, powerful changes to the body and brain. And it's not that puberty blockers are totally irreversible or harmless. It's not that taking testosterone is so harmless that you can just undo it. And, so I'm trying to give people the facts so that they have, as much information as possible to make educated decisions, so that policymakers, along with the public, can participate in a real debate and discussion with having all the facts. So not everyone wants all the facts because they're seen as not supporting their particular agenda. And people want easy, a lot of trans activists want easy access to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So they might not, some of them might not want kind of all of the facts and all the research to really be popularized in that way. But most people most of the transgender people I actually talk to are totally supportive of that, and they want kids to make the best decisions and their families.
Okay, and
then I should go. Yeah,
because
I mean, it's almost 1. I have to eat lunch.
Okay.
And okay.
It's okay. Let's maybe wrap up and finish with one question, which is, are there any important questions that you don't know the answer to? Or in other words, what important questions do you have left to ask to testosterone? Or what do you plan to work on?
One would be, what is it like to be a man? Like, what would it be like for me to take male levels of testosterone? I want to know what that actually feels like. That's a big question, just the first hand experience. And I think you guys should know what it's like not to have it. However, if you block it, I just want to throw in that if you block it, you're still not undoing what testosterone did to you in utero. So you still have that wiring. So I do think there's some sort of permanence in males. But anyway, that's a big one. Another one is that I'm interested in now, I think for my next book, is how we deal with this narrative of toxic masculinity, the idea that masculinity itself is somehow bad, and that just being male, there's something wrong with like being a male and being masculine. So I'm opposed to this idea. It's very upsetting to me. It's upsetting partly because I have a little boy, this makes me cry. He's not a little boy. He's he's 13. But I really don't like the idea that he is the message that he's getting. I don't know what it's like for you guys where you are, but here there's definitely a message that there's something wrong with being masculine. And I love masculine men myself. Like and I've got, I know, I don't want to go into that, but that's my particular preference. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I like that there's a complementarity to a feminine nature and a masculine nature, and I don't want to do away with that. And I don't want to do away with that. But of course, I want there to be a lot of flexibility. So I guess the question is, how do we support boys and men even to sort of leverage the positive aspects of masculinity and reduce male violence without stigmatizing just being a man or being masculine, because men are the ones who are fighting, for the most part, fighting our wars, and risking their lives, not just in war, but every day. There's good data on this. Women do it too, but they typically risk their lives for their kids. Men risk their lives for strangers in ways that women don't on average. And that is good data. And that's, to me, part of that physical risk taking and being masculine. And I want to sort of try to understand how to leverage that, those really positive aspects of masculinity. I want to get more into the, what's going on in childhood and puberty and how that interacts with culture, and how we can have men not feel ashamed of their desires. And I want to destigmatize all of that, I guess. And I don't know. I have to figure out how to do that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We have
some questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope that you will write this book quickly, and that we'll be able to publish it too.
Yes, do.
Anyway, Carole, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.